Welcome back to the 260th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how China is trying to court some nations in Europe now that the U.S. has been a little bit more hostile, how this incident going on in the Middle East may be Joe Biden's Vietnam, and how Boeing is actually having to delay some of its space shuttle launches. That's going to be an interesting one. Thought it was fascinating. And of course, we will end today with our DailyDelight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So we have talked previously on this podcast, or at least I have, multiple times, about how we are pushing China away, and they may start getting courted by other places. They're going to look in other locales. We know about their Belt and Road project. It's kind of faltering now, but we've known for a long time that they've been trying to make inroads, trying to get into Europe, trying to work through Turkey, all these different nations that we aren't necessarily the best of friends with. So when I saw this article, it kind of frustrated me. Not because I think we need to be the best friend of China, but we do need to be realistic in our policy, and we need to lock down. Okay, so let me move back. Well, I'll add that into my commentary about the article. What is your opinion? How do you see this geopolitical game, quote unquote, that we are playing with China? How do you see it playing out here in the future? I think it's something that we most definitely need to be very vigilant about. We have for a long time. There are lots of China hawks, but now we're starting to see their counter moves even more out in the open, especially after some of the CHIP Act engagement. And not only that, we're seeing some of our allies actually work with them and being willing to cooperate on some of these things. So we need to bring this conversation up once again in order to make sure that it is always in the front of people's minds, because we are very quick to forget what goes on with China. So let's jump into this first one. It comes from our friends over at Business Insider. China's trade war with the U.S. is unlikely to cool down this election year, so it's working on Europe instead. And I think that this is a very specific angle that Business Insider is coming at, which is fascinating, that the fact that Joe Biden in an election year is actually going to stay tough on China. You would think that the mainstream Democrat, mainstream Republican, no matter what you want to believe about where they stand on their, I don't want to say war hawkish, but their war perspective, which is any threat to the United States hegemony needs to be taken seriously, you would still say, okay, well, they're still pretty free market. They're still pretty globe oriented. They want to make sure that all these markets are open for everybody so that every single American and other nations can get the benefits of the market, whether it be in labor, whether it be in products, so on and so forth. At least when I was growing up, that was the argument of like the mainstream middle of the ground people. And Joe Biden appears, at least he did appear to be one of those people. But the fact that he's pivoting and he's following up on Trump's hard on China policies, and the fact that they bring that up in the headline, not within like the first few paragraphs, which they do, but it is in the headline that this is actually a mainstay in American politics now, I think that is extremely, extremely interesting. And I think it's one of those things that isn't getting talked about enough. This is a large cultural change, especially with the passing of the TikTok bill, where we're saying, hey, China is a national security threat. They are keeping all this data about the American people. They are trying to intimidate Taiwan. We're trying to strengthen our allegiance with Taiwan with the CHIPS Act. All of these things have lined up in a way that we are really trying to be the bulwark against China on the world stage. We're allowing Japan to remilitarize and actually have a few more ships, possibly a few aircraft carriers in the region. So there is a complete realignment on this issue. And when you see things like this that try to call it out, I am always surprised when nobody says anything. Nobody acknowledges that it's a full change. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm angry, because as I have mentioned on this podcast before, I am a person that when it comes to getting involved in other places around the world, when I look at the Israel issue, when I look at the Ukraine issue, there's lots of questions in my mind. I'm always open to geopolitical or geostrategical arguments. Maybe it's in America's interest one way or another, but you got to convince me. We got to have a long conversation, and I'm going to err on the side of not getting involved. With China, I do see that I have already gone through all of the reasoning in my mind. I've taken the time. I want to say, let's be clear, I'm not fully researched. I'm never going to know every single thing, but I've at least taken the time to know enough where I feel as though there is a strong geopolitical interest in warding off China from not only capturing Taiwan and being a stronger Asiatic nation, but also the projecting of their power on the world stage, especially because of the value system that they have and its modern aspects, its ability to bring authoritarianism into the 21st century, which is something that is extremely, extremely scary to me. Now, all those other things, there are other tactics, there are other moral positions, there are other things that these other nations want to do, and that's why I said I could be convinced about those arguments, but it's going to take a lot more on those versus China. You mentioned that we're going to take a hardline policy, and I'm going to be right there with you, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore the fact that now the mainstream is behind it too. And the part of me that's a little bit, I don't want to say anti-authority, but is a little skeptical of power, is always worried when something like this happens. Because even with the TikTok bill, while I most definitely agree that we should not be handing over our information to the Chinese government, and I do believe there's a national security argument to be made there, I think that is very different because it's talking about internal actions of the United States rather than external actions projecting itself on the world stage. And that if we really want to get rid of TikTok, which, hey, once again, all for, I don't like TikTok. I don't like when people are on TikTok for too long. I understand you can do lots of things on TikTok. You can learn important facts. You can do your history assignment by going through blah, 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 blah. Yes, there are plenty of benefits, and if you want to be on it, you are free, right? You're right to do so. You are a free American, and within this society, within this nation, you're allowed to do it. That doesn't mean I think we should, and I think it would be a social push that would be more important in that case in order to actually get TikTok out of the mainstream, make sure people are aware of its dangers, and try to get people to stop using it. But then you see the entire mainstream use the fear of China, the fear-mongering of China, trying to get people like me who say, yeah, we know China is a threat, in order to jump onto a bill like this. And it kind of reminds me of when the government co-opts fear and they co-opt the external threats, just like we did for a lot of the Cold War, in order to alter the relationship between the government and the people. So this article comes right out, says it. Nobody's saying, oh, wow, okay, this is a full pivot. Now both the Republican and the Democratic president have not only kept these policies going, but are saying that it is actually something that they can run on, because in this election year, they're implying that Biden's not going to step down. And we know that Trump also ran on getting a fair deal with China. So this is something that both can agree on. And then for you people who are a little bit like, whoa, hey, there's actually agreement, there's bipartisan support, maybe we should be a little bit skeptical. That's something you need to consider. But we've gone through why this is important domestically. Now I want to talk about externally. Quote, China's leaders' visit to France is important since the country is the European Union's second largest economy. It also follows Blinken's trip to China last month, where the two sides wrangled over a range of issues from trade to international security. They remain at odds, and disputes could heat up as the U.S. elections near later this year, says analysts. France, like the U.S. and Germany, have been complaining about China's factory overcapacity, particularly in the green sector. I'm calling for a, and this is, I'm pretty sure this is a word that I should know, but I don't, an aggiornamento. Maybe it's French, because China, and this is the continuing of the quote, because China is now in excess of capacity in many areas and exports massively to Europe, Macron told La Tribune Ménage. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that last part. Per a Bloomberg translation, Macron is using the Italian word for update as he called for a refresh in the China-France ties. So you can see that France here, Macron's like, okay, wait, we're going to keep on pressing you, China, but we're going to be willing to bring you into the fold. We're going to say that you are a valuable member of the world economy, and we want to make sure that all of our practices, all of your practices are in line. We want to make sure our economies can cooperate together, so on and so forth. And this is what happens when you push too hard. And I'm not saying that it was unjustified. I'm not saying there wasn't good reason for it. But when you push too hard, when you start putting restrictions on companies that even work with the United States, saying that they can't sell parts or chip parts to China in order to help improve their chip production system, such as the manufacturers in the Netherlands that could possibly ship different products or manufacturing materials over to China in order to help them improve their chip making process, you are forcing China to say, okay, hey, if we're not going to, go through any of these private companies, if we're not going to be able to work directly with the US in order to get some of these things done and kind of leverage their standing with other nations, we're going to go directly to big countries in Europe. We're going to talk to our neighbors who are now building up their factory base as well. So they're pushing out, and now they're realizing, okay, hey, we don't have to rely on the US's connections anymore. We can go around them. And let's be clear, they've been doing this for a long time. They're not solely reliant on the US. We're more reliant on China than China is on us. But that is changing. We're starting to rely on other nations that don't necessarily like China either. So maybe that's a little bit of an advantage. But China is starting to realize, okay, this is no longer going to be a 1.5-way street where the U.S. really relies on us and we kind of go to them to concede every once in a while. No, the U.S. is trying to make it really, really tough. They're trying to jack up the prices of our goods with tariffs and things of that nature. So we're going to seek our business elsewhere, and we're going to try to build those coalitions. That's also what we've seen them do with Iran and Russia. But it's one thing to do it with nations that are actually hostile to the United States. It's another thing to go to some of our allies and not necessarily undermine us, but at least position yourself in the place where if we go to France and we say, hey, no, you need to cut off these ties to China, they've built up the manufacturing that they're sending over to China, whether it be in EVs, solar panels, things like that, because those are some of the main industries there, whether it be the processing of minerals. And they're like, well, US, we really do want to back you. You're one of the biggest backers of France. You kind of maybe-ish supported us after our revolution, but we definitely supported you during your revolution. We believe in the liberty of the people, so on and so forth. But China kind of has our collar here. They kind of have our neck on this one because we are really relying on them for these different materials. So this is something that could be a leverage point. Not saying it's there yet, but it could very well be a leverage point going into the future. And this needs to be something that is most definitely watched. And if they are going to go to our allies and try to shore things up and try to be nice and cozy, maybe we need to give France some benefits. And yes, I understand if you're somebody from the outside who doesn't like France for some reason, I'm hawkish on China. Maybe somebody's hawkish on France. I don't know. Everybody's got their politics. Maybe they don't like the way that they set up their guns during World War II. But the point being, those people may get frustrated because they'll say, well, now, France is going to play China and the US against each other in order to get better things. And sure, that's a good point. I would say if we're involved in that game and we're actually stripping China of some of its leverage with other nations and possibly restricting them a little bit in a geopolitical way, not trying to outright, antagonize them, but just say, hey, no, we're going to offer you a better deal. We're going to try to outcompete them. And also with that comes the added benefit of a strategic partnership that China is not getting, then I think that's something that we definitely need to consider. So with all that said, I think we've talked about this one enough. Let's jump into our second article. This one comes from the Associated Press, and the headline reads, Bernie Sanders says Gaza may be Joe Biden's Vietnam, but he's ready to battle for Biden over Trump. So is that last part, is that really any surprise? Bernie Sanders, he fell in line in 2016 and 2020. He backed the person that the DNC basically hoisted up above him. So at the end of the day, I'm not surprised that he's going to back him, but he is bringing up some really important criticism that Biden has been facing. And I think it's something that we can't ignore, especially when it's coming from somebody on his left flank, not on his right flank. Because when a criticism is coming from the right flank rather than, the left flank, it can kind of be, how should I say, misconstrued. They're going to be, oh, well, no, this is just somebody from outside his party. Of course, they're not going to be happy with Joe Biden. Of course, they're not going to want him to be a person who's actually addressing any of these issues because they don't agree. So then when you hear the criticism from the left as well, even though the tone and tenor is going to be a little bit different, the issues, or at least the reasoning that Bernie Sanders wants to take this on, is going to be different. It is definitely something that you cannot ignore. Quote, in April, Bernie Sanders repeatedly stood shoulder to shoulder with President Joe Biden, promoting their joint accomplishments on healthcare and climate at the formal White House events, while eviscerating Donald Trump in a widely viewed campaign TikTok video. Also, before we go on here, the use of Biden, or Biden's White House, their use of TikTok is, and even Bernie Sanders' use of TikTok is always really intriguing to me because I don't actually have TikTok, so I just see some of the clips that make it off of TikTok. But when you have people that are both 80 years old using TikTok in order to get their message out there, it just, I don't know, it feels a little weird. I really do respect that they're trying to speak to a younger generation. It's kind of like Trump's prolific use of Twitter, speaking to the millennials and Gen Xers that are on Twitter. It's a way to reach the people directly. It feels a little bit odd because at the end of the day, I don't expect my grandfather to use TikTok. I actually just ran him through some of the stuff on a computer. And let's be clear, he used a computer before. He knows how to operate one. But, with the new interfaces and everything, these people who are older, they don't necessarily interact with it every single day. I mean, I have a dual monitor setup, and I'll tell you now, I can fly through things, and I do this every single day. And of course, I'm still not perfect. I'm just learning shortcuts and things like that. So to hand this down to people who are a little bit older, of course, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. And it feels just a little weird when people that are 80 plus years old also really strong, or how should I say it? Maybe not strong, but influential leaders within our nation are also using it. Something just kind of, there's a little ick factor to it. But I do respect the fact that they're reaching out there. You got to give them their flowers when they do something that, even if you think it feels a little bit weird, at least they're trying, and they're trying to reach to this demographic. Good on them, I guess. Quote, then, just last week, Sanders was bluntly warning that the crisis in Gaza could be Biden's Vietnam, and invoking President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision not to run for re-election as the nation was in an uproar over his support for that war. So it's actually interesting, the similarities between the campaign where, Johnson stepped down, a person like Biden kind of representing Johnson in this scenario, and having another Kennedy on the ticket, Robert Kennedy. It's not even just Kennedy, it's Robert Kennedy as well. I think there are some interesting similarities there. So maybe that's something that needs to get brought up. I heard that point from somebody else I was listening to. I was like, oh, that's an interesting one. I don't think there's going to be that many similarities because I don't think Biden's going, unless Biden has a terrible health incident. I hope that we as a nation do not have to face a situation like that. But unless that happens, there's no way that Biden is not going to step up to the plate and get through this DNC convention. And even if they did, they would probably be more likely to put in somebody like Kamala or Pete Buttigieg or even Bernie Sanders than really have Mr. RFK come out from underneath his independent tent and come back to the Democratic Party. He has already left it. He has already criticized the two-party system too much. I don't think he could make that move, and I also don't think they could make that move politically, especially with Kamala hiding in the wings. But let's get back to what the article is actually saying. Quote, such is the political dichotomy of Bernie Sanders when it comes to Joe Biden. They are two octogenarians who share a bond that was forged through a hard-fought party primary in 2020 and fortified through policy achievements over the last 3 years. Now, this election year, Sanders will be Biden's most powerful emissary to progressives and younger voters, a task that will test the senator's pull with sectors of the Democratic Party mostly disillusioned with the president and his policies, especially on Gaza. And I'll be honest, Bernie Sanders hasn't been 100% clear on this either. When it first happened, Israel needs to defend itself. Then he's criticizing the Benjamin Netanyahu regime. Then he's saying that we actually need to be. Then again, he's kind of been saying that, hey, Israel can defend itself. We also need to help the Palestinian people. He was coming out directly against Hamas. Then that kind of evolved into, okay, well, now Benjamin Netanyahu's government, there are lots of issues there that have been pointed out or at least reported on that he's trying to, use as motivation to say, hey, goodbye to Benjamin Netanyahu, whether that be the funding to Hamas that he allowed to go through, saying that, hey, we want to make sure, we want to bolster Hamas. There were arguments about this. There are articles that came out about it, and obviously Biden is not necessarily going to take that hard line. He's not going to use that. But when it comes to somebody who's trying to push a very specific message on Gaza and wants to make sure that Benjamin Netanyahu knows that there are people that don't agree with him in the Democratic Party, and let's be clear, I don't think Bernie Sanders is sitting there with a microphone, hey, Benjamin Netanyahu, yeah, I don't like you. He's doing it for internal politics. There are lots of people in the United States who don't like Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a certain contingent of people who don't like Israel at all, especially under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu with some of the new settlements that have been coming up in the West Bank. So they're obviously appealing to that certain section of the population. And I think it's interesting also when they include that part where, oh yes, he's also going to appeal to the younger voters. Of course, we know this is true because Bernie Sanders had some of the best youth turnout in the Democratic primary. You saw a lot of people in my age group, a little bit older in Gen Z, a little bit younger in millennial, that were definitely flocking towards him, which I always thought was a pretty interesting movement. I'm not saying he wasn't energetic. I'm not saying that the policies don't align on some things, but a lot of the people I would interact with in person who they said, oh yeah, I'm cool. I kind of want to get Bernie Sanders in there. And then you would start examining some of the policies and, maybe 1 out of 10 they would agree with, but not necessarily all of them. The Medicare one, on principle alone, they were like, yeah, okay, 100%. And then you start examining, it's like, okay, so you understand that this may happen, this may happen, this may happen, so on and so forth. One of the interesting ones that I always bring up, which is if we have a truly nationalized or even a forced state-by-state healthcare system, which could be an interesting way to go about it, because even in Britain, they actually have, Scotland has their own system, Britain has their own system, I believe Wales also has their own system, and so in the United Kingdom, they have their medical system, but it's broken up by different jurisdictions. So maybe you could say, hey, no, on a federal level, we're just going to mandate that states have it. That'd be an interesting one, and we could see if that would work out. I think there are still certain issues, but one of the counterexamples I always give is, should we have a nationalized healthcare system where basically the taxpayers are going to take on the burden of the people that are unhealthy? And then when they say, I think that, if the tax rate isn't too high, we should definitely take it on. I'm like, okay, that, sounds like a moderate position. What about the fact that now, since every single taxpayer and the government is responsible for the health of the citizens, the argument to restrict certain types of food, certain types of beverages, like how they were trying to get rid of I believe it was 32-ounce drinks in New York a few years ago, and they used the argument, well, okay, this is going to actually lower the tax burden for people in the future because we're going to have less people having these terrible diseases that come from eating these certain types of things. And some people would be like, yeah, I'd actually be okay with that, because at the end of the day, I want us to be healthier too as a society. And there are the other people who are like, really? They would be able to restrict that? I'm like, well, technically they would be able to restrict it, but you're just making it easier, the argument easier, because now they would be able to say, instead of before where it's like, oh, well, we want to look out for the health of our people, then you can easily rebut that with the idea of, well, hey, we're individuals. I don't want you to mandate. While I appreciate that you're looking out for me, that you're looking out for the people, it's a great sentiment, but we can look out for ourselves. We are not children. Now, the argument's harder to make because the counter argument to that now is, well, hey, this is going to be something that we have to do in order to lower the cost, because now your decisions no longer just directly affect you, or at least you could argue that they never solely just affect you, but now it becomes even more of a burden on everybody else, not just in the repercussions of your actions, emotionally, but even financially, because we are taking on the financial burden of every single person who uses the healthcare system. And the individualists and people really start to spring out at that point because they didn't consider those sort of arguments. So while I'm saying that, yes, Sanders definitely speaks to a certain contingent, there are people that 100% support him, there are people that have thought through his issues and are 100% on board. I don't think that the support among those people was as strong and as passionate as it really was portrayed to be, and they were kind of just going along with the movement as it was, which is great because, hey, you want to be a part of a cool movement. But upon further examination, the policies that could spring from a type of candidate like Bernie Sanders were not necessarily supported by the individualistic type of people who are really present in Gen Z and a little bit in the later half of the millennials. So yes, I think they can speak to that certain part of the population, but I do think there is a growing contingent of people that look at Donald Trump's way of doing things and it's like, okay, yeah. Don't mess with me, I don't mess with you, try to keep it out of your life. And that's kind of the conservative message overall, especially some of the more populist Republicans, even though they have a little bit of a reactionary string. That is the message they at least put out there on paper. If you did the same thing with Bernie Sanders and started expanding and explaining how their policies would may actually interfere with people's lives, then maybe they would have a different opinion. So I think that it's a little bit more split, and Bernie Sanders isn't just the youth poll that he used to be, because people had time to live underneath Trump and they've had time to grow up and see what it's like underneath a Biden, and maybe their opinions have switched a little bit. So with all that, let's jump to our final article that goes to an interesting subject. It's from NBC News, and the headline reads, Boeing forced to scrub first crewed Starliner launch to the space station. And when I heard that this was happening, I was like, whoa, how did I not hear about this before? Because I had heard that they had contracts. I had heard those sort of conversations where, oh, yes, they have contracts just like SpaceX, and like the Orion, or I guess it's Blue Origin by Jeff Bezos, that they are doing, fueling trips, they're doing people trips, they're actually sending cargo up to the International Space Station, these basically privatization efforts by NASA in order to make it cheaper to get things into space, but also to promote this new space industry. And I wasn't really keeping up on most of it. Some of the news has been quiet, and at the beginning of this podcast, I used to cover these things every once in a while, and I wanted to return to it. So let's go through some of the details really quickly. Quote, NASA and Boeing were forced to stand down from an attempted launch to the International Space Station on Monday because of a last-minute issue that cropped up with a valve on the spacecraft's rocket. The mission controllers declared Monday's launch was scrubbed after an anomaly was detected on the valve on the United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rocket, which the Starliner capsule was to ride into orbit. And that's a lot of words there. Just call it the Falcon Heavy. Just call it the what is SpaceX calling their largest one, the cargo ship, Starship, I think. Yeah, just go with the simple naming, and you'll actually stick in people's names more, in people's minds more, rather than this really long name. What was really interesting, or scary, honestly, is that even though it was 2 hours before the flight was to leave, the crew was already in the capsule. So I'm happy they called it off. I'm happy they're safe, and they said that this will not be brought back into consideration. They won't be launching in any earlier than Friday. So Friday and after, you may see some new headlines, but they're redoing their safety checks. They're making sure that the weather's okay. So just watch out for that one. And we'll see if SpaceX has any new competition getting cargo up to the International Space Station. So, with all that story, all those other things out of the way, let's jump into our final story from the... I gotta make sure I add the first part. It's called our Daily Delight. And this one comes from Buzz60. And the headline reads, Cuteness Alert. Zoo shows off rare baby Colombian black spider monkey. And I will tell you now, they are not wrong. the animal, very, very cute. When you see the mother carrying it around, you're like, okay, I see what you're getting at here. Good for you, girl. Good for you. I'm happy that you had that little baby. I'm happy that I'm not saying that we have to spend all the time in the world making sure that these monkeys are, repopulating, because at the end of the day, we got to focus on ourselves first. But if we can spare a little bit of time and help them rebuild their habitat and see them thrive again, that'd be absolutely phenomenal. And if you want to see this cute video, or you want to read any of today's articles, there will be links in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcast, as well as Podvine. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.